After 42 years of teaching high school literature, I didn't want much from retirement, just a little quiet, a patch of grass and a place to put my books. So when I bought the house at the edge of Briar Hills, I wasn't looking for a grand estate. I wanted somewhere modest, somewhere the wind could come through the trees and rattle the wind chimes without complaint. Somewhere I could build a small shed, not for storage, but for solitude. The shed was never intended to be anything controversial. It started with a weekend trip to the lumber yard, a few sketches on the back of a napkin, and a stubborn determination to use my own hands, something I hadn't done in years, 10 feet by 10 feet. Cedar paneling, reinforced beams. A skylight salvaged from an old greenhouse I found on Craigslist. Every board I nailed down was a kind of prayer, a whispered rebellion against the noise of the world I was leaving behind. I called it the Grove. I didn't mean to name it, but it came naturally. It sat under a crescent of sycamores that shaded the western edge of my yard, and when I opened the double doors at dusk, the sunlight spilled across the wooden floor like gold leaf on scripture. Inside were a few essentials: a bookshelf, a writing desk, a wool chair passed down from my father, a place for my records, a few old sermon cassettes I'd collected over the years, nothing fancy, but it was mine. I'd check my mailbox every morning, coffee and hand slippers on. HOA newsletters arrive monthly full of cheerful warnings about holiday decor, weed, height, and garbage bin placement. Nothing about sheds. No clause in the thick binder of bylaws they gave me the day I moved in. I knew because I read every page. My shed was within the legal easement, not visible from the road, painted the same shade of beige as my house. In every possible way, I followed their rules, even the unspoken ones. And for the first 6 months, no one said a thing. Neighbors came by, waved over the fence. Some even asked to see the inside. I offered tea. I offered silence. One elderly woman asked if I held poetry readings out there. I didn't, but I took the compliment. Even the HOA president, a sharply dressed woman named Barbara Whitaker, passed by during her morning walks. She smiled at me, nodded toward the shed, and said, "Looks very harmonious." I took that as approval. So I added a few finishing touches: a copper weather vane, a small plaque above the door that simply read "The Grove," and just for me, an old cross that once belonged to my grandfather, hung inside on a nail that had been bent and straightened more times than I could count. It wasn't a church, but it was sacred. Then, on the first Monday of May, the letter came. No envelope, just a folded sheet of HOA stationery stuffed into my mailbox with "urgent" written in bold marker across the top. Briar Hills Homeowners Association. Notice of violation resident, Mr. Leonard Hale, address 2235, Amberwood Lane, date May 6th. It has come to the board's attention that a structure has been erected in the backyard of your property without prior approval. Per Section 12.4 of the HOA Architectural Guidelines, any auxiliary structure must be submitted for review and approved before construction. You are hereby ordered to remove said structure within 14 calendar days, or face daily fines of $50. Sincerely, Barbara Whitaker, President, Briar Hills, HOA. I stared at the paper, read it again, Section 12.4. I pulled out the binder, flipped through until I found the clause. There it was. 12.4. All sheds or auxiliary structures must be approved by the Architectural Compliance Committee. But when I'd read it before the section had been marked, proposed, a guideline not yet passed, I flipped to the addenda. No update, no signatures, nothing dated after January. I opened my email, typed a message to the HOA. Dear Mrs. Whitaker, I received a violation notice regarding the small shed in my backyard. To my knowledge, Section 12.4 has not yet been formally adopted. I'm happy to meet and discuss this. Please advise. Respectfully, Leonard Hale. I hit send and waited. No reply that day, or the next. But on Wednesday, I noticed something new, a pair of strangers walking past my house, stopping to photograph the shed. They wore HOA badges and carried clipboards. On Friday, a second letter arrived, this one more stern. Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action. Your structure is out of compliance and undermines the aesthetic integrity of the community. undermines the aesthetic integrity. I sat in my little shed that night, listening to Mahler's Fifth through an old speaker, wondering how something so simple, so quiet, could be so offensive. What was it about this space that made them so uneasy? Was it because I didn't ask permission? Because it wasn't sterile or symmetrical, or maybe because it wasn't theirs? That weekend I tried one more time. I walked down to the HOA office, an overly air-conditioned annex near the community pool, and asked to speak with Barbara. She met me with folded arms and a smile sharp as window glass. "Mr. Hale," she said, "this really isn't personal. Then why does it feel like a crusade?" She didn't flinch. If everyone built whatever they wanted, this place would look like a flea market. I followed every rule I said, even painted it to match. "You didn't get approval. I didn't know I needed it." She slid a copy of the guideline across the counter. "It's your responsibility to stay informed." I looked down at the page. Same section 12.4. Still no signatures. "Is this even legally binding?" I asked. Barbara's eyes narrowed. "We're not here to debate the law. We're here to maintain harmony." She leaned in. "You have until the 20th, Mr. Hale. Take it down, or we'll take further action." That night, I sat inside the grove with a pad of paper and a pencil. The breeze whispered through the trees, and for a moment I almost gave in. I could take it down. Fold the structure, donate the lumber, pretend it never mattered. But something in me refused. The shed wasn't just wood and nails, it was peace. It was purpose, and if they were going to come after it, I would need something more powerful than aesthetics or bylaws to defend it. So I kept reading, searching. And by the time the morning light broke across the floorboards, I had found what I was looking for. A line buried in a 1993 federal case upheld by the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act structures used for the practice of religious or spiritual activity are granted heightened protections from zoning and HOA interference. I leaned back in my chair, heart, steady mind clear. They wanted a war of paperwork. I was going to give them a sanctuary. The following morning, the sunrise felt different, less like a promise and more like a deadline. I had 14 days according to their letter. 14 days to undo something that had brought me nothing but peace. 14 days to disassemble quietly what I had built with care. But I wasn't going to use those days for demolition. I was going to use them to redefine what stood in my backyard. I started with research, hours combing through federal court rulings. I read blogs written by civil liberties attorneys. I looked up zoning cases in other states, buried in all that was a pattern, a legal shield hiding in plain sight the protection of spiritual spaces. In the eyes of the law, a tool shed was one thing. A sanctuary, that was something else entirely. By noon, I was already sketching ideas, not just for how to defend the grove, but how to transform it. But before I could get too far, another letter arrived. This time, it was hand-delivered, folded in half with my name handwritten in ink on the outside. It wasn't from Barbara. It was from the Architectural Compliance Subcommittee, a name I hadn't heard until that moment. It sounded official, bureaucratic, and somehow both hollow and threatening. Notice of escalation, Mr. Leonard Hale. This letter serves as formal notice that your unauthorized structure remains in non-compliance with the architectural integrity standards of the Briar Hills HOA. As such, the matter has been escalated to the full board. Please be advised that continued failure to comply may result in the following: daily fines up to $100, forced removal, and cost recovery. Legal action through civil court. Sincerely, Tanya Ellison, Chair, Architectural Compliance Subcommittee. Tanya, not Barbara. So the troops were being called in. I folded the letter and placed it in the folder with the others. I labeled it HOA Offense. Then I started another folder, HOA Defense. Inside, I placed a printout of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act of 1000. I highlighted the relevant sections, including no government shall impose or implement a land use regulation that imposes a substantial burden on the religious exercise of a person or assembly of persons. It didn't take long to realize the implications. If I were to formally establish the Grove as a place of religious reflection, I would fall under a completely different category of land use. It wasn't about turning it into a megachurch. It didn't need stained glass or pews. According to multiple case precedents, even a private personal spiritual retreat qualified for protection if it was sincere and served a faith-based purpose. So that's exactly what I did. I wrote a charter. I called it the Sacred Grove Fellowship. It was simple, one page. A mission of peace, silence, and reflection. A space for quiet thought, contemplation, and the occasional reading of sacred or philosophical texts. Not denominational, not performative, just sincere. I registered it as a private religious nonprofit under my name. The paperwork was accepted online the next day. It cost $76. I posted a sign outside the shed, Sacred Grove Fellowship, Private Reflection Chapel, founded 2023. Inside, I added a few new items: a wooden cross, a worn copy of the Tao Te Ching, a leather-bound Bible from my grandfather's shelf, and a pair of meditation cushions under the window. Then I wrote a letter of my own. To the Board of Briar Hills, HOA, I respectfully inform you that the structure in question, formerly referred to as a shed, has now been designated a private religious sanctuary under the name Sacred Grove Fellowship. Per federal law, under the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, RLUIP, and reinforced by case law, including Lighthouse v. City of Bellevue and Westgate Temple v. HOA Board of Red Springs, this structure is protected from HOA zoning enforcement due to its religious use and purpose. Any attempt to remove, fine, or interfere with the structure will be considered a violation of my federally protected rights. Attached: proof of nonprofit registration, Charter of Sacred Grove Fellowship, legal summary of relevant RLUIPA protections. Sincerely, Leonard Hale. I printed 3 copies. Mailed 1 certified. Hand-delivered another. Slipped the last into Barbara Whitaker's mailbox, folded with a yellow post-it that read, "Let us not fight. Let us learn." 3 days passed. Silence. No letters, no visits, no clipboard carrying volunteers pacing the perimeter of my yard. Then on the 4th day, I caught sight of Tanya Ellison outside my fence, pacing slowly along the sidewalk, arms crossed, a phone in one hand. She stared at the sign above the door of the Grove. She took a photo. Later that afternoon, an envelope was taped to my front door, this one not official looking, no letterhead. Just a simple piece of white paper. Mr. Hale, it has come to our attention that you have reclassified your structure as a religious facility. We are currently reviewing our options. In the meantime, we ask that no events be held with more than 10 attendees and that no sound amplification devices be used. Thank you, Briar Hills, HOA. That was it. No threats, no fines, just boundaries, a ceasefire. I stepped into the Grove that evening and let the quiet settle around me like a blanket. The amber light from the setting sun slid through the skylight. The cross on the far wall cast a long shadow across the floor. I sat in my chair and opened the Tao Te Ching. To yield is to be preserved whole. To be bent is to become straight. They wanted to bend me. Instead, I turned. And in turning, I built something they couldn't touch. Not because it was clever, not because it was rebellious, but because it was grounded in something deeper than bylaws. It was sacred. For a moment, I had hoped the letter from the HOA signaling review meant they were willing to back off quietly, to let the Grove stand so long as it didn't cause a fuss. But if I'd learned anything from the first 2 letters, it was that bureaucracy rarely surrenders, it simply regroups. So I tried to meet them halfway. Not because I had to, but because I still believe that reasoned civility and open dialogue had a place in a neighborhood like ours. That maybe we could have a conversation instead of a courtroom. I emailed Barbara Whitaker, the HOA president, one last time. Dear Mrs. Whitaker, I would like to request a meeting with the board to clarify the intentions and usage of the Sacred Grove Fellowship. I believe we've arrived at an unfortunate misunderstanding, and I'm confident that respectful discussion can lead to mutual understanding. Please let me know if the board is willing to meet. My door is open. Regards, Leonard Hale. She didn't reply directly. Instead, I received a short message from the HOA secretary, Mr. Hale. The board will allow you to speak for 5 minutes at the next community meeting scheduled for Thursday, May 18th, 6:30 p.m. at the clubhouse. Please confirm your attendance in advance. Sincerely, Sarah Longley, HOA Secretary. I confirmed. I printed out the nonprofit registration, the charter, and highlighted key passages of the Religious Land Use Act. I rehearsed what I would say not like a sermon, but like a defense, not of a structure, but of intent. That Thursday, I walked into the HOA meeting and felt every pair of eyes land on me. The room wasn't hostile, just uncertain, curious. A few neighbors offered tight-lipped nods. Some had likely heard rumors. Others, I suspected, were there just to see what I would do next. The board sat at the front of the room, behind a long folding table, Barbara at the center, flanked by Tanya Ellison, and a man I didn't recognize who introduced himself as Rick, acting legal liaison. Barbara gave me a faint smile as I approached the mic. It didn't reach her eyes. "You have 5 minutes," she said. I nodded. "Good evening," I began, voice steady, projecting without force. "My name is Leonard Hale. Many of you know me as the Quiet Man on Amberwood Lane with the small shed in his backyard. Some of you have even seen inside it. You know it's not a garage, not a workshop, not a storage space for anything illegal or disruptive. You know it as what I built it to be, a place of quiet reflection and peace." A few people in the audience nodded. I continued. "When I built the Grove, it wasn't to defy the HOA. I followed every existing guideline. It wasn't until the rules changed or were interpreted differently that I received warnings, so I complied with the law. Not your version of it. The one written into our country's constitution. I registered the Sacred Grove Fellowship as a legally protected religious sanctuary. I held up the registration, set it gently on the table in front of the board. This is not a loophole. It's not a trick. It's faith. And while I may not hold services with choirs or pulpits, I gather my thoughts there. I meditate. I read scripture. And I seek stillness in a world too loud to listen. I looked up at Barbara, then the others. All I ask is that you leave it alone. The room was quiet for a breath, maybe two. Then Tanya spoke. "Mr. Hale, with all due respect, this seems like a convenient reclassification to avoid compliance." I looked at her squarely. "Convenient or not, it's legal. And more importantly, it's sincere." Barbara cleared her throat. "The board will discuss and notify you of our decision." I nodded and returned to my seat. A week passed, then came the letter. "Official HOA Determination Structure Review, Mr. Hale. After internal review, the board remains concerned that the Sacred Grove Fellowship does not meet the definition of a legitimate religious institution. We are consulting with legal counsel and pursuing avenues to challenge the registration on the grounds of misuse. In the meantime, you are hereby ordered to cease all activities inside the structure. Continued use may result in escalated enforcement, including legal action. Sincerely, Barbara Whitaker, resident Briar Hills, HOA." So that was their answer. They weren't interested in compromise. They weren't interested in understanding. They were interested in winning. I posted the letter on my refrigerator, not as a warning, as a reminder. Then I returned to the Grove. I unlocked the doors. I stepped inside, and I sat. I didn't meditate. I didn't read. I didn't play music or light candles. I just sat. Because there are some battles not worth fighting with fists or fire, but with presence, with patience, and I knew something they didn't. The moment they tried to define my faith for me, they stepped onto ground where HOA rules held no power. And the law was on my side. 12 days. That's how much time I had left before the HOA's so-called final deadline hit. 12 days until they claimed they'd issue daily fines. 12 days before, according to the latest letter, they would pursue corrective demolition. That phrase stuck with me. Corrective demolition. As if the shed wasn't just a structure, but a flaw in the landscape, something offensive to the uniformity they clung to. It reminded me of an old Orwellian line. "We shall squeeze you empty, and then we shall fill you with ourselves." And that's exactly what they were trying to do, erase something that didn't fit. Each morning I walked out and opened the doors to the Grove. I lit a small candle, sat in silence for 15 minutes, and then went about my day. I made no noise. I invited no one. but still I could feel them watching. The HOA patrols became more frequent. Barbara started walking her little dog past my house twice a day instead of once. Tanya's car slowed noticeably whenever it drove by. Once I caught her taking photos from behind her sun visor. And then the neighborhood whisper campaign began. First, it was Mrs. Langford, a woman I'd once helped carry groceries. She avoided eye contact during our mail pickup. Then the Myers kids, who used to wave enthusiastically every time they biked past my driveway, stopped waving. I saw them glance over, then pedal faster. And just like that, the grove became a symbol. Not of peace or silence or even resistance, but of tension. I tried not to take it personally. People fear what they don't understand. That's nothing new. It's easier to fall in line than to question the one who's being questioned. But I'd spent my life trying to teach young people how to think for themselves, how to find their voice. I couldn't very well lose mine now just because a few people found it inconvenient. Still, the days moved quickly and the pressure mounted. On day 10, I received another letter, this time hand-delivered by 2 board members wearing polos embroidered with the Briar Hills logo. I recognized one of them, a man named Joel, who once complimented the roses along my walkway. Now he wouldn't even meet my eyes. Final warning, Mr. Hale. You are in violation of Articles 12.4, 3.2, and 8.9 of the Briar Hills HOA Covenant. You have refused to comply with official directives. As of May 20th, your property will be subject to administrative penalties, including $100. Day in fines. Potential lien placement, enforcement of structural removal by contractor at HOA discretion. You may appeal this decision at the monthly board meeting on June 2nd. Sincerely, Barbara Whitaker, President, Briar Hills HOA. I read the letter once, then again, then I laughed. Because something about it, its absurd certainty, its sterile coldness pushed me from frustrated to calm. The kind of calm you only reach when the storm no longer matters. When the ground you're standing on is yours, regardless of who claims it isn't. That night, I wrote my final response. To the Board of Briar Hills, HOA, I have received your final warning. As previously stated, the Sacred Grove Fellowship is a private religious sanctuary. It is protected under the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, RLUIPA, a federal statute that supersedes HOA bylaws and zoning regulations. Any attempt to find, destroy, or interfere with this space will be considered a violation of federal law. Should you proceed, I am prepared to pursue legal action on the grounds of religious discrimination and violation of my constitutional rights. Additionally, I have notified local media outlets and civil liberties organizations of this issue. Any action taken against the Grove will be viewed under public scrutiny. I recommend you consult with your legal counsel, real legal counsel, before proceeding. Respectfully, Leonard Hale, founder, Sacred Grove Fellowship. I sent that letter by certified mail. I also posted a copy of it on the shed door. And then I waited. Day 11 brought silence. Day 12 brought a knock on my door. I opened it to find a young woman in a gray blazer holding a clipboard, flanked by a cameraman with a press badge. Mr. Hale. Yes, I'm Taylor Jensen from Channel 7. We received a tip about a homeowner being threatened with demolition over a religious sanctuary. Do you have a moment? I stepped outside, heart steady. I have more than a moment, I said. I have a story. We sat on the porch for 20 minutes. I showed her the letters, the registration, the shed itself. She stepped inside, whispered, "Wow," and took a slow pan with the camera. It aired that evening. The headline read, "Retired Teacher Turns Shed into Sanctuary, HOA, Threatens to Tear It Down." The next morning, I awoke to over 24 emails. Some were from neighbors' apologies, support shock. Others were from strangers, lawyers, pastors, activists. But one stood out. It was from a regional office of the American Civil Liberties Union. Mr. Hale, we saw your story. What they're doing is not just wrong, it's unconstitutional. We would like to offer you legal representation pro bono should the HOA move forward with any action. You're not alone. I stepped into the Grove that afternoon, lit the candle again, and sat in the same chair I had built with my own hands. The trees swayed above. The sun filtered down. And I smiled not out of smugness or triumph, but something quieter. Relief. Because I hadn't backed down. I'd stood. And now the world was watching. I didn't sleep much that night. Not from worry, oddly, that had started to fade, but from something else entirely. Anticipation. Momentum. The kind of nervous energy you feel when something inside you is about to shift, when a quiet decision begins to rise into a loud purpose. By sunrise, the news report had traveled further than I ever imagined. The local station's website had picked it up nationally. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years emailed me. Links texts came in from former students who recognized my name. Even a voicemail from a small-town radio host asking if I'd do a call-in interview. But the most surprising call came from a pastor I'd never met, a Reverend Curtis from a small interfaith congregation 1 county over. "Brother Hale," he said warmly, "you've lit something. People are talking. I know we've never met, but I believe in what you're doing. Would you consider hosting a small gathering? Nothing big. Just a few of us who believe sacred space can be anywhere." I hesitated. "I didn't build this place to become a movement," I told him. But maybe, he said gently, it was waiting to become one. That evening, I stepped into the grove and sat in silence, just like I always did. The candle flickered. Light bled gently through the skylight. But this time, I didn't open a book. I didn't lean back and close my eyes. I stared at the walls, at the beams I had measured and cut with precision, at the floor I had stained by hand, at the way every part of this structure held something more than intention. It held story, meaning, devotion. And I realized something. Barbara and the HOA hadn't just tried to tear down wood and nails, they tried to define what mattered, to shape the contours of community in their image. What made them uncomfortable, they tried to erase. But sacred doesn't ask for permission. Sacred declares itself, and so I stood. The next morning, I visited the county clerk's office. The same woman who had processed my nonprofit registration 2 weeks earlier was now sipping coffee from a Best Nana Ever mug. She smiled when she saw me. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Quite the local celebrity now. Wasn't exactly the goal," I chuckled. "Good things never are," she replied. I handed her the paperwork. "I'd like to file a conditional use request. Designation of my private structure as a permanent spiritual assembly space. I believe the law supports it under RLUIPA." She nodded without hesitation. "We'll process this. May take a few weeks. In the meantime, I assume the HOA knows." I smiled. "They're watching every move I make." That same day, I contacted a local woodworker I once taught. He was running a small custom sign company now. I sent him a sketch, a carved wooden plaque with a simple tree in the center and these words: "Sacred Grove Fellowship, rooted in peace, protected by faith." He delivered it 2 days later. I mounted it above the entrance to the grove just as the late afternoon sun hit the siding. The warm glow turned the letters gold. It didn't look like a shed anymore. It looked like a sanctuary. But the moment that changed everything wasn't mine. It came 2 days later. On a quiet Sunday morning, I was tending the roses along my front walkway when I heard hesitant footsteps behind me. I turned. It was Mrs. Langford, the same woman who hadn't looked at me since the HOA letters began. She was holding something, a bundle of white carnations wrapped in brown paper. "I saw the story," she said, voice tight. I'm sorry I didn't say anything earlier. I was afraid they'd come after me too." I straightened. "It's all right." "No," she said firmly. "It's not." She handed me the flowers. "My husband built a shed years ago. Barbara made him tear it down. Said it lowered property values. He died 6 months later. That shed was the only place he ever felt at peace." Her voice cracked. I set down the trowel. "Would you like to see the grove?" She looked up surprised. "Could I?" I nodded. "Of course." She followed me through the gate, past the garden, and to the small path leading through the sycamores. When we reached the doors, I opened them wide, stepping aside. She entered like someone crossing a threshold into memory. After a few moments, she sat on the bench by the window, hands folded in her lap, eyes glistening. "It feels like a prayer," she whispered. I didn't speak. I just let the silence answer for me. That visit became the first of many. Over the next few days, more neighbors came. Quietly. respectfully. Some brought candles. Others left slips of paper with prayers. One child, no older than 8, brought a drawing of a dove and asked if it could hang on the wall. I framed it. The grove had become more than a shed. It had become a mirror reflecting back what people longed for but hadn't known how to ask for peace. Space. Permission to feel. When Barbara saw the new sign, she sent a terse email. Mr. Hale, it has come to our attention that your structure is now being referred to as a fellowship and is receiving outside visitors. This constitutes unauthorized use of property beyond personal scope. Please cease all gatherings immediately or face legal review. Barbara Whitaker, President Briar Hills, HOA. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. By then, the county had received over a dozen messages from residents supporting the designation. The ACLU had formally submitted a letter warning against further HOA interference. A second news piece aired this time with Mrs. Langford's permission to tell her husband's story. Public sentiment was no longer behind the HOA. It was behind the Grove. The deadline passed quietly. No fines, no contractors, no demolition, just sunlight, and the sound of a chime stirring in the breeze. I suppose I should have known she wouldn't give up that easily. Barbara Whitaker was not the kind of woman who faded into the background. She was the sort who fought rust with polish, fought wind with duct tape, and fought anything unfamiliar with paperwork and suspicion. And now, despite the quiet I had fought to preserve the Grove, was beginning to draw the very thing she feared most attention. The county hadn't yet ruled on my conditional use permit, but the momentum was unmistakable. Neighbors stopped whispering. More than 20 residents signed a letter of support and submitted it to the HOA. Even the local pastor, who first called me Reverend Curtis, offered to hold a blessing ceremony on the property if I was willing. I was tempted. But I wasn't reckless. I still wanted peace more than spectacle, which is why, when Barbara delivered a certified letter taped to my front door 3 days later, I took a deep breath before peeling it free. Notice of HOA enforcement proceedings, Mr. Hale Parr, the authority of the Briar Hills Homeowners Association. You are hereby summoned to attend a formal hearing scheduled for Thursday, 7:00 p.m. at the Community Hall. The subject of the hearing will be your continued unauthorized use of personal property for organized religious functions and the potential legal ramifications thereof. You are entitled to present a statement and evidence. Counsel may attend. Failure to appear may result in default judgment, daily fines, and legal action as permitted by HOA Charter. Respectfully, Barbara Whitaker, President Briar Hills, HOA. The letter was written like a verdict, a closing argument before the trial had even begun. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Because I had something far stronger than defiance. I had receipts. The day of the hearing, I arrived 10 minutes early wearing my old gray sport coat and holding a single folder. Inside were my nonprofit documents, the county permit application, the letter from the ACLU, and a copy of the RLUAA statute. The community hall was already half full, mostly board members, and a few familiar faces from around the neighborhood. I noticed Joel again, the man who once complimented my roses. He looked uncomfortable. Barbara sat at the head of the table, lips pressed tight, her signature clipboard stacked with papers like weapons. The meeting was called to order. Mr. Hale, Barbara began crisply, we're here today to address your persistent violation of HOA covenants regarding unauthorized structures and unapproved gatherings. Would you like to make a statement? I stood calmly. Thank you, I said. I turned to face the room. For the past few weeks, my small structure registered as the Sacred Grove Fellowship has been used as a place of silent reflection and prayer. There have been no amplified events, no traffic congestion, no disturbances. It is quiet, private, voluntary. I held up the folder. I am protected by federal law, specifically the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. This law supersedes HOA regulations when a property is used for religious assembly and prohibits undue burden or discrimination. I laid the letter from the ACLU on the table in front of me. They are watching this case closely. A few murmurs rose in the room. Joel shifted in his seat. Barbara's eyes narrowed. And what exactly qualifies this as a religious use? She asked. Her voice sharpened. Because it looks an awful lot like a tool shed with curtains. I didn't flinch. Respectfully, I replied, that is not for you to define. The law protects sincerity, not architecture. The room went silent. Then quietly, almost reluctantly, Mrs. Langford stood up in the back row. Her voice trembled, but it carried. My husband built a shed too, she said. Barbara made him tear it down. That space gave him peace, and he never recovered when it was gone. She looked straight at the board. What Leonard has built is beautiful, and for the first time in years, this neighborhood feels like a community again. Someone else stood, Reverend Curtis, who had quietly taken a seat near the door. He simply said, this is what religious freedom looks like. Then Joel stood. I move that we dismiss this hearing, he said, his voice steady, on the basis that continuing it could expose the HOA to federal litigation. Barbara's mouth opened, but no sound came out. A second board member raised a hand. I seconded it. A third. All in favor hands went up 4 out of 7. The motion passed. Barbara sat in stunned silence. The meeting adjourned. Outside, the night air was cool and gentle. A few neighbors lingered to shake my hand, some offering soft words of apology, others just nods of respect. Mrs. Langford hugged me. Reverend Curtis placed a hand on my shoulder and said nothing. He didn't need to. But the moment that stayed with me came from Joel as he walked out last. You're not the enemy, Leonard, he said quietly. Some of us were just afraid of what might happen if we stood up to her. I nodded. Standing up doesn't always mean shouting. He smiled. Well, tonight it echoed. Barbara didn't resign. Not yet. But her grip cracked. And in that crack, something new began to grow. Not defiance, not resistance. Hope. The grove remained standing. And so did I. The days that followed the hearing were quieter than I expected. Not just in noise, but in energy. There were no follow-up letters, no strange men inspecting property lines, no passive-aggressive leaflets about community aesthetics. It was as though the HOA machine had paused, not broken entirely, but winded like an old watch waiting for its gears to catch again. But in that pause, something unexpected happened. The grove bloomed. It began with Mrs. Langford. She returned the next day, not with flowers, but with a book of poetry and a folding chair. She didn't knock or announce herself. She just slipped quietly into the sanctuary and read aloud to the empty room, her voice rising and falling like wind through a canyon. I watched her from the kitchen window. She stayed for nearly an hour. That evening, I found a note taped gently to the grove's door. Today was the first time I felt Leonard smile again. Not you, my Leonard. Mine. Thank you for helping me find that echo. ML. Within a week, there were more. A teenage boy I didn't recognize left a single candle and a note that read, I'm not allowed to go to church anymore. Thank you for this. A young couple came by with their baby, asking if it was okay to just sit inside and breathe. One man stooped and quiet knelt on the floor and wept without saying a word. I said nothing. I asked nothing. The grove asked nothing of them either. Then came the request that shook me. A woman in her mid-30s named Olivia, a nurse I'd never met, knocked on my door holding a small wooden box. Inside was a photo of her father, dressed in military uniform, smiling beside a fishing boat. This was his metal box, she said softly. He passed last fall. We didn't have anywhere to put it. He wasn't religious, but he loved trees and silence. She looked past me toward the path. Would it be all right if I left this there? Just for a while, I swallowed hard. Of course. That evening, I placed the box on a shelf I built above the grove's window, just under where the candlelight spilled onto the floor. I didn't touch the contents. I didn't need to. It felt right. The grove was no longer mine. It belonged to those who needed it. By the end of the month, something miraculous happened. The HOA newsletter changed tone. Instead of the usual rigid formatting and stern directives, it opened with a community spotlight featuring the grove. The article was brief, unsigned, but warm. The Sacred Grove Fellowship has become an unexpected place of healing and quiet for several of our residents. We encourage everyone to explore, respect, and support the spaces that make Briar Hills a more compassionate neighborhood. Beneath it, a small photo of the carved wooden sign I had hung weeks ago. No mention of me. No mention of the hearing. But that was fine. The Grove didn't need a headline. It needed hearts. Barbara, however, did not disappear. She remained on the board, less vocal now, but visibly frustrated. Her power wasn't gone, but it was diluted. Neighbors who once followed her lead now nodded to me at the mailbox. A man I didn't know offered to help me mulch the front garden. A woman from 3 streets over dropped off homemade jam with a post-it. You stood tall. Thank you. I never set out to lead anything. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I built a place to breathe. But sometimes breathing is the most radical act. One morning I found an envelope under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Notice of special HOA vote motion removal of current HOA president. Reason conduct. Harmful to community trust. Sponsor multiple residents. I read it twice, 3 times, then set it aside. I didn't gloat. I didn't plan revenge. I simply returned to the Grove, lit a candle, and sat. That weekend, neighbors gathered on the lawn, some with picnic blankets, others with coolers. A few brought guitars. Kids ran through the grass chasing soap bubbles. Olivia set up a table with the tea and fromage and fresh lemonade. Mrs. Langford read a poem about resilience, and Reverend Curtis spoke softly about grace. We didn't call it a service. We didn't hang a flyer. It wasn't political. It wasn't performative. It was peace. And for the first time, it wasn't fragile. It was rooted. Like the trees that shaded us. Like the stories that grew in their shadow. Later that evening, I stood at the edge of the grove and watched the fireflies rise. Someone had hung tiny bells from the branches, delicate notes that sang with the breeze. The sky turned lavender, and laughter from the lawn drifted toward the sanctuary like a hymn. I thought of Carolyn, my late wife, and whispered, "You would have loved this." And somewhere inside me, I felt her smile. I should have expected the emergency meeting. Barbara wouldn't let go, without a final act, a last desperate reach, to reclaim what had slipped from her hands. The HOA board, despite their growing disillusionment with her, still had procedures to follow. And Barbara, in her familiar script, triggered one with the oldest tool of all fear. It began with a memo, typed bold, delivered to every mailbox in the community under the guise of urgent safety concerns. Recent, unauthorized gatherings and construction activity related to the so-called Sacred Grove Fellowship may pose structural and legal hazards to our neighborhood. Please attend a mandatory board session to discuss community risks and vote on emergency HOA resolutions. At the bottom, Barbara's signature. She was trying to paint the Grove as a liability, something volatile, unregulated, dangerous. This time it wasn't about aesthetics or bylaws. It was about fear of loss, property values, control predictability. But it was also, I realized, about me. She hadn't forgiven the hearing, the vote, the erosion of her authority. Now she wanted it all back. I didn't plan to attend. I'd already said what I needed to say. I believed in peace, not provocation. But on the day of the meeting, I received a call from Joel. "You should come," he said gently. "She's spinning the narrative hard. We need a voice of calm in the room," I hesitated. Then he added, "People are scared, Leonard. But not of you, of her. They just don't know how to stand up without someone to stand beside." So I went. The community center was packed. Rows of folding chairs filled to capacity. More stood along the walls. HOA board members sat stiffly at the front table, Barbara in the center, dressed in a crimson blazer like it was battle armor. She had binders in front of her, printed charts, enlarged photographs of the Grove. When she saw me, her mouth twitched, but she didn't smile. I sat quietly in the back. The meeting began. Barbara launched into her presentation. Slide after slide painted the Grove as a non-conforming structure, a fire hazard, a precedent for further community disruption. One image showed the interior filled with candles deliberately zoomed in to make it look crowded, reckless. Another showed a gathering on the lawn captioned, "Unregulated event, no permit filed." Then came the proposal, Emergency Resolution 32 Ball, religious or communal structures not approved by the HOA Architectural Committee must cease operations pending safety inspection and legal review. The room buzzed. This was a veiled attack not just on the Grove, but on the right to gather to pray to share space without HOA interference. Barbara cleared her throat. "This is not about religion," she said. "It's about safety. about standards, about preserving the community we all chose to be part of. Then she smiled. Cold. Tight. If Mr. Hale would like to speak, he's welcome to. Otherwise, we'll proceed to a vote. I rose. Not quickly, not dramatically. But the room quieted. I walked to the front, not to the microphone, just to stand by the table. I didn't need amplification. The room was already listening. I looked at Barbara, then at the crowd. I built the Grove alone, for silence, for healing, not as a protest, not as a statement. I never asked for this fight. I turned to the audience. But if it must be a fight, it's not one against your homes, or your values, or your safety. I gestured to the photos. Yes, there are candles. All are enclosed in fireproof glass. There are fire extinguishers on every wall. Smoke detectors on the ceiling. The floor is treated pine with flame retardant. I know this, because I designed it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a laminated card. My certification as a retired fire marshal is still valid in this county. I placed it gently on the table. Barbara stiffened, and while we're talking about safety, I continued, may I ask, when was the last time the HOA audited our hydrants or reviewed the evacuation plans for our elderly residents in case of a brush fire? No one answered. I nodded. Exactly. Joel raised his hand from the board table. I'd like to motion that we table Resolution 32B and instead commission an independent safety audit of the Grove and the neighborhood. Murmurs turned to applause. A second board member quickly added, I second. Barbara tried to interrupt, but the vote proceeded. 5 hands went up. The motion passed. Barbara's face collapsed into something sour, something brittle. The room had turned. That night, Joel walked with me back to my truck. She won't stop, he said. You know that, right? I nodded. But now she's fighting momentum. Not just you. He paused. You gave this place more than a sanctuary. You gave it a mirror. Over the following weeks, the safety audit revealed a number of concerning issues, but none at the Grove. In fact, the auditor praised its construction, fireproofing, and emergency exits. In contrast, the HOA office itself had out-of-date wiring and no fire suppression system. Barbara's credibility, already wounded, was quietly bleeding out. She resigned 2 weeks later. The notice was small. No fanfare. No admission of fault. But the effect was seismic. And for the first time, I saw children playing near the Grove without parents rushing them along. I saw neighbors bringing baked goods and staying for conversation. I saw eyes that used to look down now looking up. The Grove remained open. The light stayed on. And the war was over. The irony was this: for all of Barbara's noise about preserving tradition, it was the quiet spaces that saved us. After her resignation, something shifted in the bones of Briar Hills. There was no parade, no ticker tape celebration, just a slow unwinding, like a community exhaling after holding its breath for far too long. The new interim HOA president was a man named Dennis Park, a former school principal with a calm voice and a deep appreciation for listening. I didn't know him well, but he showed up to my door one morning with a clipboard and said simply, I'd like to ask the community what they want this place to feel like again. Can I sit in your Grove and listen? I made coffee. He stayed 2 hours. That was the beginning. Word spread that the HOA was holding open sessions, not meetings, not votes, just conversations. No agenda, no timer. Residents could come speak, suggest, or just sit in the back and observe. People came. At first cautiously, then in groups. They talked about things I hadn't expected: how lonely some had felt during Barbara's rule. How small decisions, garden color limits, mailbox placements, letters about porch lights had built walls instead of bridges. They talked about fear, about silence, about regret. One woman stood up and said through tears, I told my kids not to wave at Mr. Hale. I thought you were a troublemaker. I'm sorry. I nodded. Not to dismiss her apology, but to honor it. Forgiveness isn't noise. It's gravity. Dennis asked me to join the Community Advisory Committee. I declined at first, but he persisted. You already are, he said. You just haven't accepted the title yet. So I joined. We didn't rewrite the rulebook overnight, but we did rewrite how people were heard. The Grove remained open, but now it had help: a volunteer list to tidy it weekly, a donation box with no lock, a shared calendar, in case someone wanted to reserve quiet time or bring in guests. Local teens started using it for music recitals. One group of seniors hosted meditation circles there on Tuesdays. No money changed hands. No slogans, just time. And care. Something else changed too. Neighbors who had never spoken before began trading tools again. Baking trays, seedlings, jokes. We reopened the community garden that had been locked up for years under the guise of insurance risk. The first harvest of basil and tomatoes brought smiles that I hadn't seen in seasons. Joel, now a full board member, asked if I'd consider hosting a fire safety and BBQ skills workshop for the neighborhood. I laughed, then agreed. The flyer, hand-drawn by a local girl, read Backyard Barbecue and Burn Safety with Mr. Leonard and his famous ribs. The turnout surprised everyone. That day, something beautiful happened. I stood at my old grill, now gleaming thanks to a neighbor who volunteered to polish it, and looked out at a crowd not divided by bylaws, but united by picnic tables. Joel flipped burgers while teaching kids how to check a gas line. A retired electrician offered tips on wiring smoke alarms. And in the corner of the yard, beneath the branches of the trees that shaded the grove, Olivia knelt with her son and pointed up at the small wooden cross inside the sanctuary. I heard her whisper, "This place was built from fire." But it became peace. Barbara did not attend, but I heard she had moved to a condo in another neighborhood, one with a stricter HOA charter. Perhaps she needed that. Perhaps she needed rules to feel safe. I didn't resent her. In her own way, she forced the grove into being. She tested the fabric of our community. And when that fabric didn't tear, when it bent and folded and stretched around each other instead of snapping, we discovered something deeper than civility. We found trust. Later that summer, Dennis proposed a new community tradition, the Night of Quiet Lights. No loud events, no fireworks, no speeches. Just neighbors placing small lanterns outside their homes, lighting pathways and porches, and sitting in their yards with whoever wanted to join. No HOA oversight. No minutes recorded. Just light and presence. On the first night of Quiet Lights, I stood at the grove, with a lantern in one hand and Carolyn's old blanket draped across my shoulders. A breeze lifted the leaves. Laughter drifted across the neighborhood. Someone played guitar down the street. Somewhere a baby cried. And in that noise, I heard harmony. A community doesn't have to be perfect to be good. It just needs to remember how to begin again. As I walked back toward the house, someone had left a note on the grove's bench. "Thank you for staying. We didn't know we needed you until you made space for us to breathe." No signature, but it didn't need one. The grove had its own way of knowing who wrote what. And I once, just the man with the unauthorized shed, was now simply Leonard again. A neighbor, a builder, a keeper of fire and peace. The last Saturday of September had always meant something in our family, Carolyn's favorite weekend of the year. It marked the change of seasons, the first crispness in the morning air, the smell of oak leaves and distant chimney smoke. She used to call it the Gold Line Day, when the sun dipped lower and made everything glow like honey. After she passed, I stopped hosting our annual BBQ. It felt hollow without her laugh, echoing from the back porch, without the way she'd quietly sneak extra seasoning into my dry rub or hum country tunes while prepping coleslaw in the kitchen. For 3 years, the grill stayed covered, and the deck collected more dust than footsteps. But this year, something in me shifted. The grove was thriving. The community was healing, and I no longer felt like I was standing on the edge of something broken. So I sent out an invitation. Annual hail, backyard. BBQ returns, all welcome. Below it, I added a handwritten note, bring an appetite, a story, and someone who deserves a second chance. The preparations began the week prior. Joel and a few teenagers from the neighborhood helped me sand and restain the picnic benches. Olivia dropped off homemade napkin holders crafted by her son's art class. Mrs. Keating offered to handle vegetarian options, and even the McIntyres, once firmly in Barbara's corner, donated 2 coolers of iced tea and lemonade. No one asked for rules. No one asked for permission. The HOA, now operating with transparency and kindness under Dennis's leadership, simply sent a note, "We'll be there." That morning, I woke before sunrise. I lit the smoker just like I used to when Carolyn was still here. I laid out the ribs she always loved, letting the scent of hickory curl into the early air. I walked the perimeter of the grove, brushing my hand across the grain of the doors, pausing at the plaque we'd placed in her memory. She gave fire its warmth. The first guests arrived around noon. By 2 o'clock, my backyard had become something between a potluck and a miracle. There were veterans sharing stories with teenagers over cornbread, parents teaching toddlers how to roast corn without burning their fingers. People who'd once only nodded stiffly across the HOA meeting room now stood shoulder to shoulder laughing as they debated the proper level of heat for a good dry rub. It wasn't just a BBQ, it was a reckoning of goodwill. At some point during the day, Joel raised a toast. He tapped a fork to a plastic cup and cleared his throat. Everyone here knows Leonard Hale as the guy who built a fire-safe shed, stood up to an HOA storm, and somehow turned wood and silence into sanctuary. Laughter. But what you might not know, he continued, is that he also saved this neighborhood's soul. Not with rules, not with votes, but by staying when it would have been easier to leave. He looked over at me, and by cooking the best damn ribs in the state. The crowd erupted. I just smiled, nodded, and waved it off. Carolyn would have teased me for blushing. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, I walked around checking the fire pits and ensuring every coal was cooling safely. Old habits die hard, especially when you've spent 3 decades fighting blazes others can't see. A boy named Mason ran up to me. "Mr. Hale, can we see the fire extinguisher again?" I nodded and led him to the side of the house where I showed him the pressure gauge, the nozzle, the proper sweep technique. He listened with bright eyes and serious nods. His mother approached after and said, "Thanks for showing him that. His granddad was a firefighter too. This means more than you know. It always does." Later that night, when most of the guests had gone home and the lanterns were lit again along the grove, I stood alone by the grill. The coals were nearly gone. But the warmth remained, not just in the cast iron or the soil, but in the air itself. The kind of warmth you can't light with a match. The kind that comes only when truth, justice, and community stop being ideas and start being people. People who listen. People who change. People who gather. I thought about Barbara, not with bitterness, not even with triumph, just reflection. She had tried to douse every fire I lit. But fire, when tended properly, doesn't just destroy. It refines. And so did she, by accident or fate, force this neighborhood to look itself in the mirror and remember what it meant to live with one another, not under someone else. As I turned to go inside, I passed by the grove's doors one last time. I whispered, "See you tomorrow," like Carolyn used to say, her voice always tinged with hope, never finality. And for the first time in years, I felt whole. Not because I won anything, not because the HOA fell, but because I remembered who I was. A fire marshal, a neighbor, a husband, and a man who built something sacred from wood smoke and the stubborn refusal to give up on home.